Hank Hoffman, now retired, was the former executive director and programming director for Best Video Film and Cultural Center in Hamden, Connecticut. An archivist of the New Haven original rock music scene since the late 1970s, Hank has cassette and digital recordings he's made at hundreds of shows. Along with being a fan and supporter of the local music scene, Hank has been a musical participant as both a live performer and recording artist with the psychedelic pop group Happy Ending and punk band Dada Banks. In addition, Hank released 2 studio mini-albums of psychedelic pop in 2020 under the name The Alex Butterfield, backed by a who's who of local music luminaries. Before we go to the interview, let's start with a track called Planned Community by Happy Ending, from the group's first LP, Have a Nice Day.
It's the modern way to live out our days in our plans community. Pay your bills on time and you'll be free of crime in an atmosphere of tight security. They'll fill up your time with things to do. They hide fun social activity. Structure your day for you from morning through, and at night you have a drink and watch TV. Sitting alone, facing those choices about my life. Freedom and uncertainty cut me like a knife. But looking around, I see the way that it will be if I lose myself inside the planned community. Work from 9 to 5, or if you are retired, you play poker in the rec all afternoons. Dinner time at 6, company at 8. We'll be leaving at 10 because it's late. Sitting alone, facing those choices about my life. Freedom and uncertainty cut me like a knife. Looking around, I see the way that it will be if I lose myself inside the planned community. It's the price I pay to try and get away from the planned community. Pay my tax each year and work to suppress the fear bubbling up in insecurity. Sitting alone and it's getting lonelier each year. Autumn was my season, but now I start to feel like the leaves turn crisp and gold and falling from the trees. I'll be raked into the basket of the planned community. I'll be placed inside the casket of the planned community. I'll be raked into the basket of the planned community. I'll be placed inside the casket of the planned community.
What was your first musical memory?
My first musical memory was probably, maybe Alan Sherman's Hello Mudda, Hello Fada, the Alan Sherman's My Son the Nut comedy album. It had Rat Fink, and You Went the Wrong Way, Old King Louie, and the most famous one from there was Hello Mutta, Hello Fada. Here we are at Camp Granada. Camp is very entertaining, and they say we'll have some fun if it stops raining. And then after that, I remember we had the album for the Davy Crockett, Disney's Davy Crockett. So it was things like that. We played kids music until February of 1964.
Well, what happened then?
I missed the first Beatles show. It was on February 9th, which is the night before my 8th birthday. But that next morning at bus stop going to school, Warren and Wayne Grosjean next door were telling me about these Beatles who were on Ed Sullivan. I'm sure I was watching Walt Disney's Wonderful World of Color. And they didn't like them, so I didn't like them. I was a follower, not a leader. And I went into school, and everybody's talking about the Beatles. And I think a few days later, we went down to breakfast, and my father had bought myself and my two younger brothers Beatles black and white trading cards. And so that was my first glimpse of them. And they looked like all right guys. I didn't want to tell my father I don't like the Beatles. And then that next weekend went over to a cousin's house who briefly lived in the same town as us, and they played me, I Want to Hold Your Hand. I saw her standing there, and then I watched the second Ed Sullivan, and it was life-changing. And all of a sudden, music was like something I really deeply cared about. And, shortly thereafter, we got the Meet the Beatles album that all three of us brothers had to share, and then I got my own copy of the Beatles' second album, and my brothers were relegated to introducing the Beatles. And we played them all the time.
How long did it take for that, former opinion to wash away?
About 4 or 5 days. And it's something that will never happen like that again. I know this is like very Hope Boomer thing to say, but this is life-changing for me, and that's why I brought this book. This is a book called In My Life, and it's encounters with the Beatles. It's essays from a bunch of different people, but there's one in particular by the rock critic Greil Marcus.
One of my favorites.
Yeah, and he was at Berkeley at the time. He was University of California at Berkeley. And he writes, there had been an item in the paper that day about a British rock and roll group that was to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show that night. The Beatles, a photo too. Were those wigs or what? I was curious. I didn't know they had rock and roll in England. So I went down to a commons room where there was a TV set, expecting an argument from whoever was there about which channel to watch. 400 people sat transfixed as the Beatles sang I Want to Hold Your Hand. And when the song was over, the crowd exploded. People looked at the faces and the hair of John, Paul, George, and Ringo and said yes. And who could have predicted a few extra inches of hair would suddenly seem so right, so necessary? Brian Epstein? They heard the Beatles sound and said yes to that too. Something that could change the life of like an 8th grader in 3rd grade and college students. I mean, it can't, nothing will encompass that type of mass cultural phenomena ever. It's just, everything's too genre divided and siloed and micro-targeted. But and then on that Christmas of 1964, I got a little transistor radio, so I was plugged into the local WICC top 40 station. And then the following summer, we went out to visit cousins who had moved from, aunt and uncle who had moved from Connecticut out to L.A., a suburb of L.A., and my older cousin Brooke got this music newspaper, the KRLA Beat. And I thought, wow, that's so cool. It has news about the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And we went on a road trip, and, Ticket to Ride and Satisfaction were playing all the time. And, came back, and that fall, Brooke just bought me a subscription to KRLA Beat. So I may have been the only kid in Connecticut getting this music newspaper from L.A. every week or every other week. So from like 1965 until 68 when it ceased publication, I was reading about all this stuff and, seeing the culture change too, because all my issues, I think, were given away by my mother at some point, but I bought a ton of them back on eBay many years ago. And, it goes from all just, very teeny bop type things to starting to talk about, protest music and the war and, riots at, police riots at anti-Vietnam demonstrations in L.A. and drugs. And you'd look at these charts from, particularly for me, the middle 1966, top 40, and it's amazing how many, 30 songs on there are songs that have stood the test of time. And so it was just, music is just amazing. It was, for me, so life-giving. And I was a very shy, introverted kid. And
were you creative at all before then, or that kind of set the...
Yeah, I liked writing stories. I liked drawing, things like that. So yeah, I was creative. When I started getting into comic books, I started wanting to draw my own comic books. I read Hardy Boy mysteries, so I wrote my own mysteries. I had a little spiral notebook where I'd write this stuff in and make up poetry and drawings and stuff. So yeah, I was very into sort of, if I'm into this, then I want to sort of do my own thing around it. I was in my own world in that sense.
And where'd you grow up?
Well, at that time I was living in Trumbull. And then in 1966, my dad passed away really quickly. He had a heart attack and he was very young. He was 37. And my mom got remarried a couple years later, and we moved from Trumbull to Fairfield. So I lived in Fairfield and Southport until I graduated from college. I spent a year or so living in Norwalk and then moved up to New Haven. And I moved up to New Haven for the music scene.
But before that, you were kind of palling around with Randy, right?
I met Randy Stone in probably the winter of 1973-74. Randy had gone to Staples High School, and then he had transferred for his final year of high school to Greens Farms Academy, and my closest friend went to Greens Farms Academy, and through him, my social circle was actually more going to parties with kids from Greens Farms Academy than Roger Ludlow High School, which is where I went. And Randy was a music fanatic. He was also interested in sort of politics, too, so we shared that, too, interested in collecting campaign buttons and things like that. And so we would spend tons and tons of time in his panel basement with albums all over the wall and listening to music and other things. And he was the one who drew my attention to punk rock. He got a copy of the second New York Dolls album. This is probably shortly after they'd pretty much broken up. It was a cutout by that point. Came up to another friend's house and, let me play this for you. And I'm like, come on, look, I don't want to hear those freaks. And he played it, and I think he recalls me saying, wow, I like that. And so we both got our hands on the first one, and this was, maybe the beginning of 1975, maybe toward the end of the set. Anyway, it set us up. And he was going to Fairfield University at that time, and he knew someone named Bert Kearns, maybe through the WVOF, the college radio station. And Bert was, a journalist. He wrote for he ended up writing for the New Haven Advocate, and he was tuned into a lot of what was going on. And so I remember coming home from college in the summer of end of my junior year, summer of '76, and Randy had Punk magazine, and so we're going through Punk magazine, and he was also reading Village Voice, so I was starting to hear about some of the stuff that was going down in New York. But then he had already picked up a bass by that time, so he was starting to play bass, and he's like, I remember I was up there and he didn't have a bass. I came back, from end of school or whatever, and he had a bass and he was already playing along with Stanley Clarke. He was just like, I'm not like that, but he had a bass, so we saw the stories in punk about the Ramones and all these groups and their first record that came out. So when turns out they were going to be playing up in New Haven at this club, the Arcadia Ballroom, in July of 1976. So I'd gotten the record not long before that. And I remember listening to it because that night I went, when I was sleeping, I had this nightmare of sort of like people in Bonnie and Clyde cars being riddled with machine gun bullets while Ramones music played in the background. Because when it first came out, those buzzsaw guitars and those lyrics about beating up the brat and chainsaw, there was something scary about it. Obviously later you could look back and it's cartoonish, but it seemed dangerous compared to so much of what we were listening to. But we went up, myself and Randy, another friend, Jeff Riley, went up to this show, which was Ramones' first show in New Haven, and I just loved it. I mean, it was great. The place might have been half, 3/4 full when they came on, and 2 or 3 songs left. Almost all those people bailed, so it was only about 1/4. The hardcore people who were left, probably tons of whom ended up being in bands in New Haven. And so I started going up to shows in New Haven to see touring groups, and I saw Johnny Thunders and Wayne Kramer, who had a band, Gang War. I saw Richard Hell and the Voidoids, and including a show that turned out to be the last show with their sort of classic guitar lineup of Ivan Julian and Robert Quine, and they were just fantastic. I couldn't believe how good they were. And John Cale, Roy Loney formerly of the Flamin' Groovies and the Phantom Movers. And one of the things I started noticing was that I would bring up my little cassette deck because I'd started recording shows. And I went up there with a cassette to record the headlining band. And I started realizing, wow, these local opening bands, they're pretty cool too. And so that started getting me interested in that. And at that point, Randy had convinced me to get a guitar. It's like the Ramones album, you could play this too. You should get a guitar. So I got a guitar. As it turned out, I couldn't actually play that too. Playing Johnny Ramone plays, that's really hard. But bands were good. I started to get to know some of those bands. And there was another aspect of New Haven that was attractive. It was a local artist, creative person named Ernst Weber, who was involved in cable access video, and he would be videotaping shows, and he put out this really cool sort of underground arts newspaper called Oasis de Neon. So it was starting to feel like there was a creative community with an emphasis on community built around this new music going on up there. I remember going up to, a friend of mine had moved from Westport up to a place called Daggett Street, which was an old factory building in New Haven that had artist lofts since probably the late 1960s. And they had, him and his girlfriend had a loft on the top floor of one of the buildings of Daggett Street. I thought, wow, this is cool and bohemian. And he invited me up to go see a purely local show, which was a benefit for Oasis de Neon, and so it was all local bands. And each one was great in their own way. I mean, there was one in particular, Disturbance, who ended up being my favorite band of that whole scene, but there was the Saucers and this group of like maybe young teens in the Obvious, one of whom, Ray Neal, ended up going on to Miracle Legion. And so in 1980, I ended up getting a job with a consumer environmental group, Connecticut Citizen Action Group, and I was going to be a community organizer. They had gotten VISTA funds from the federal government, and I was going to be, I think, in Stanford. And then my friend Rick said, hey, there's a loft that's become available in Daggett Street if you're interested, and sort of figured out that I could probably afford it if we subdivided it and his girlfriend used part of it as a workspace. So CCAG was kind enough to sort of switch my assignment to the lower Naugatuck Valley, and in the summer 1980, I moved up to New Haven. And I moved up there for the music scene, and I was spending 3 or 4 nights a week at Ron's place that summer. And at the time, the music scene, it was a community. I mean, I knew some of the people, started to get to know more people, particularly bands that I liked and felt approachable. I'd start to, talk to them, say, like your show, and I'm Hank. And So there was Disturbance, there was Radio Reptiles, Saucers. It was a phenomenal group out in New London called the Reducers. And but they were all different, and they all had their unique approach to things. And it was and very few of them had sort of the buzzsaw Ramones type sound. There were influences from DMC5, Velvet Underground is a big influence on a lot of the bands. You're just 60s pop. And so I got into that, and I'd gone up to that Oasis and Neon benefit, which might have been in the spring or late winter of 1980, and then Rick told me that one of the bands I was interested in seeing from that again. The Obvious is playing at this club called Ron's Place, and Ron's ended up becoming the sort of punk rock bar. I mean, some of the punkish bands or new wave bands, underground bands might get gigs at some other places occasionally, or there's a place called the Oxford Ale House, or Toads if they were having a touring act that had a national record label like the Ramones. But Ron's Place was sort of not run, but booked by the musicians themselves. And so I went up on this Sunday afternoon. As it turned out, the Obvious had already broken up. They had one or two gigs and then they broke up. But there was this band, the Regular Joes, and they were punk rockers. And I think they were from like East Windsor, and their lead singer was writhing on the floor of the place. I see my vomit coming up in chunks. I thought, yeah, this is music. And so, but I felt like I was entering a private club. Jukebox had all punk rock or 60s classics on it, and I eventually got a 45 that Randy and I made with our own punk band. On that jukebox, I felt like I'd really arrived. So that was part of it. So Ron's Place became a headquarters. But the punk scene, I got into it late. I mean, it'd probably been going on for a couple of years. That they'd been searching out musicians who were starting to form their own groups, and at the time, clubs were only booking cover bands, and so groups that were playing original music, had to sort of go and find their own places and sort of, make their way into it. And so there was, I guess, some strip club in Bridgeport, in a place that might have been called St. George Hotel, and it was called the Snake Pit. So they had bands there. And then they found a bar in Devon called the Shandy Gaff, and they had groups there before finally starting to get into the Oxford Ale House, which I guess had a new wave night. And there were a lot of people who played there who I missed, but I guess Elvis Costello played there. I don't know if the B-52s played there, but a lot of I saw the Ramones there. But there were a lot of shows I heard that were great at the Oxford Ale House. And it's a small place. It was right at the beginning of Whitney Avenue. And Ron's Place just kept on going until Halloween in 1981, and they had a big sort of blowout show then. And then after the show, they closed, and people just stayed to party. And then it was raided by the New Haven police, who arrested some 30 people there. Which one of them probably would have been me, except I had a Halloween party at Daggett Street that night with Disturbance and this band playing their first gig, Skunkadelic. And so we had a bunch of people there, and I later found out that a couple members of Skunkadelic were going to Yale. Eileen Markell was one of them, and she was very good friends with Jodie Foster. And Jodie apparently considered coming to that show, but finally decided she wouldn't really know anybody else, so she didn't. This close degree of separation to meeting Jodie Foster and hosting her at a party. But and then after that, the scene moved to a club in West Haven called Brothers 3. They had a lot of great groups there, a lot of great shows at Brothers 3. And
was that at all connected to Ron's at all, or no?
No. It was essentially when Ron's closed down. I don't know whether it was because I don't recall the exact reasons why that happened, but Ron himself was kind of a dodgy guy. I remember one time I was there with I went to see Radio Reptiles there, and after their set, we were in the broom closet that passed for the dressing room, and Ron was there regaling us with tales of inviting the hookers in off of the corner of Chapel and Park and enjoying their favors on the stage at Ron's, after the bar had closed. It was not very gentrified area at that point in time. But I think Brothers 3 was probably just a place that, if I had to guess, I think Mark Mulcahy, who had been drummer for Saucers and then drummed for another couple of bands before forming his own group, Miracle Legion, was doing a lot of booking under the name Red Spot Productions. And my guess is he went to the old guys who ran Brothers 3 and said, hey, can we use this room for shows? We think we could bring in a lot of people who will buy drinks, and it worked. They had some really good crowds there, and so the guys who ran Brothers 3 said, maybe we should take this to the next level, and they opened the Grotto down in New Haven, which is sort of an underground club, and was the main sort of alternative music club from 1983 until 1988. It was killed the way a number of clubs were killed by the raising of the drinking age from 18 to 21.
Not the raising of the rent?
No. I think it was the audiences started becoming smaller. I mean, maybe my impression was that it was due to the rise in drinking age, and so they lost 3 years of people who might turn out for shows. But there was some highlight. I remember the night that Miracle Legion was playing. At the same night, REM had been playing at the New Haven Coliseum, and after the show, they came over to the Grotto, and I remember Michael Stipe sitting at the bar with his eyeliner on, and Peter Buck got up for the Miracle Legion encore to play the Doors' Roadhouse Blues. There were a lot of great shows at Ron's place. It was mostly local bands, but occasionally they'd have a touring band come through, and there was one touring band that I didn't see at Ron's place, this little hole-in-the-wall club. I remember I actually have the flyer for the show because I used to sort of take down flyers. I've got a whole stack of flyers from the punk shows. And I kept the flyer, but I thought, the name of this band sounds like a synth pop band. And I'm not into synth pop. I'm not interested. It was REM, and it was probably a few weeks after that I read a review of their first independent label, 45, in New York Rocker, and with chiming guitars. So, ooh, that sounds like something I'd really like. And so I ended up, grabbing that 45, which I later made a nice, pretty penny selling on eBay because it was apparently the first press, of which there were only 600. But that's the one I missed. I missed seeing REM at Ron's place, which would have been pretty cool. I did see him as an opening act for Ventures at Toad's place. But anyway, so people were hustling and looking for places to play. And, unfortunately, there were a lot of great bands that didn't have the money to put out records. I mean, records did come out, but, some of my favorite bands, like Disturbance and Radio Reptiles, never put out a record. Skunkadelic, who were led by a lead guitarist named Steve Ulrich, who now is in a great band down in New York, this instrumental, it's called Guitar Noir Trio called Big Lazy, and he does music for film and television. Phenomenal guitarist. But he was in Skunkadelic, which sort of combined ska rhythms with, twangy surf guitar. They did some reggae covers, but they also had some, songs of their own, and they managed to get a record out on Virgin in France because they went and did a year over in Paris, which is a great record. And I think at least 2 of the cuts can be found on YouTube. Spinal Dread, which was a fantastic song, and Mood Swing. So I was recording live bands, and I got a band together before I moved to New Haven with Randy Trio, sort of a punk rock.
What made you want to record live bands, live music?
I got the bug because I was working at Sam Goody in Westport, and there was a guy I was working with. He was a young guy, but jazz pianist. He was the fellow in the store who sold the stereo systems and turntables. His name was Pat Marafiotti, and he apparently liked to record live music. And legendary jazz saxophonist Dexter Gordon was going to be playing a show at the Players Tavern, which is a Toad's Place-like club, used to be near where Westport Country Playhouse is. And he couldn't go because he had a gig, and he asked me, because I was going to be going to the show with some friends, hey, can you take my little cassette deck and record this show? I said, yeah, sure. And so I took it and got a pretty decent recording, considering we were sort of off to the side of the stage. It all depends where they have their speakers set up. But I got a nice recording, and I made a dub for myself and gave it to him. I said, I got to get one of those recorders. Then I started taping shows at the Players Tavern, and shows at Toad's Place and Oxford Ale House. First the touring bands, and then I started recording local bands. And I mean, I have hundreds of cassettes.
And it's just the cassette deck, or is there mics or setup? Or?
The first one was like a mono cassette deck. And it was relatively expensive for the time. It was like $180. It was really solid, but it was mono, and if the sound in the room was good, then I could get a good recording. But if the sound was sort of blown out and there's tons of bass, then I might get lots of woof in the recording. But I did get a lot of really decent recordings given. And then at Ron's place, I used to set it up. There was a little shelf along the wall at Ron's place. You just set it there. And, I did that for many, many shows. I'd set it there, and I'd get a beer, so I'd just walk away and leave it recording. And then one time I came back, and it was no longer there. Someone had stolen it. So I borrowed a lesser cassette deck from Randy, which I used for a while until I got some money, was able to get a stereo cassette deck, which was upgraded. And then when that finally conked out, I got one that was even better. But it just having this bootleg, things weren't accessible back then. That's the other thing about it that people should know. I mean, it was all secret knowledge. There was no internet. And sometimes now, I sort of like, how the hell did I find out about this stuff? I have to say, how did I learn about this stuff? And so we were reading the Village Voice, we were reading New York Rocker or Punk magazine. Everything would come as a rumor first. And so when you heard about the Sex Pistols, it was just a rumor. They didn't have any records you could get. I mean, until finally some of their import singles came over. But it was all rumors, all descriptions of this stuff. I remember reading Robert Christgau in the Village Voice on the band Television and trying to sort of envision in my head, what that could sound like. And when I was, I went to College of William and Mary, and, the second semester of my final year, senior year there, the college radio station decided to have a punk rock special that night, because this is before punk became acceptable on college radio stations. So the folks who ran it looked down on this. These are people who can't play. They can't. They're not good like Yes or whatever singer-songwriter or the Eagles. And they apparently put the show on some radio neophyte, and so he was picking out records. And I remember hearing this crazy riff, and I heard it, and I said, that's got to be Television. And it was either Friction or Marquee Moon. But I heard this crazy riff. It was just from what I'd read. That had to be Television. But he was, I think he may have been saying on air, I don't really know anything about this punk stuff. So I sort of called him up and ended up going over to the studio with my New York Dolls and Ramones records. And he had just been looking in the stacks and trying to pull out records that had people in sunglasses on the cover. So I remember sitting out in my parents' backyard in Southport, still living at home before I moved out, listening to one of the New York radio stations that Lou Reed would say, and all of a sudden I hear this, I thought, that's got to be the Sex Pistols. It was God Save the Queen, because I guess there were a lot of good writers in those days, but just the descriptions of it, the intensity of those opening chords of that song, wow, that's got to be this that I've been reading about. So there was a lot that you were reading about, and for me, it was all living up to the hype. And Randy and I would go, we'd go into, take the train into Manhattan and go down to Greenwich Village to Bleeker's Bob's and buy, the punk rock 45s on the wall based on the picture sleeves, and then come back and, and listen to them and have a good laugh.
Was Cutler's in the picture at all? They had a decent imports section from what I heard, but...
They weren't for me really until I moved up to New Haven. The first place I went up to New Haven, there was a store, Festoons, that had a lot of great stuff. I think the first time I went there, I was at this point also starting to get into the 60s garage rock, because Randy and I had each gotten a copy of Nuggets, and then I was starting to hear about these bands, which of course touched something in me because I've been listening to radio in 1966, and some of these were songs I heard, but now there was a whole different context to it, and it was both these things, both the garage rock and the punk stuff, taught me an interesting lesson about culture, because I realized, wait a minute, culture is so much deeper than these corporate companies putting out major labels putting out records. It's like it's happening everywhere. And I remember after I got Nuggets, then I was starting to search out some of the recordings by bands that were on Nuggets, and I went into Festoons and got a copy of the first Question Mark and the Mysterians record. They weren't actually on Nuggets, and they had an album by the Sonics, who I'd heard read about, and I said, guy there, so what does this sound like? And it said original Northwest punk. He goes, Ramones, Sex Pistols. Well, it didn't sound anything like the Ramones or Sex Pistols, but it had its own unique energy to it. So I would go up there and start finding stuff, and go into New York City to Bleecker Bob's. Randy, I think, for some reason, had reasons to go to Meriden. I think his father was an executive with J.C. Penney, and I think they had a store in the Meriden Mall, but they had a record store there, Record Express, that had some hip guys working there. So they got a lot of imports there too. And once I started working at Sam Goody's, I would browse the Gem Records catalog and start trying to bring imports into there too. I remember we got in an album that was a reissue of record by The Remains, and they have a very strong Westport connection, because both Barry Tashian, who was the lead singer and main songwriter, and Billy Briggs, who was the keyboard player, I think went to Staples High School, and got that record in. And then they were a group that had a song on Nuggets, and it was a great record. I remember playing it in Sam Goody's, and people would come in, is that The Remains? Because of course people were familiar from when they used to play Westport, and I'd say, yeah. I'd say, I'd love to get that. And I tried to put special orders through, and Sam Goody's did not ever, manage to get another copy of the Remains record, unfortunately. And I remember seeing Barry, at the bar, one of the bars. It used to be sort of around just across the bridge, nursing a drink some point. I thought, I should go up and talk to him, because I heard he gave guitar lessons, and I started to play guitar, but I was too shy. I kick myself now. I would have loved to have had Barry. I might actually be a good guitar player if I had.
When does guitar start coming into it? And then we had veered to a different topic, but you started to bring up recording with Randy.
Yeah. I probably got the guitar the end of 1976. I got, a friend of my younger brother's had a cheap Japanese Les Paul imitation. My mother was willing to give up $150 for it. So I got it, and shortly thereafter started trying to write songs. And, got another friend to play drums. And it was just all in Randy's basement. We did that for a couple of years. I came up with a few songs. We'd be playing covers like Holidays in the Sun or Remote Control by The Clash, or and I was just really wrong. I didn't know how to play punk guitar, because I was doing up-down strokes. I didn't realize I was doing it all wrong until Johnny Ramone died. I thought, okay, so that's why it didn't sound right. But after a couple of years, shortly before I was going to be moving up to New Haven, we decided, hey, let's take two of our songs and go to a studio in Westport, 4-track studio, and record songs and put out a record.
What studio was it?
It was Scoville Studios, was called. It was the engineer was a guy named Jeff Jones. So we did it there, and then we had the record pressed at Cook Labs in Norwalk.
There was a pressing plant in Norwalk.
In Norwalk, yeah. They had their own label too, Cook Labs. They put out mostly like calypso music. I think I have one, Cook Records, but yeah, they had a Mighty Sparrow, stuff like that. They had. I think they were well known for that. But yeah.
How many did you press up?
I can't really. I think either 300 or 500. I can't exactly remember. But one of my friend Rick Fearberg sent one copy to this music magazine based on the Pacific Northwest called OP. It was sort of for the Lost Music Network. So it was Lost Music Network, LM, and OP for OP. And the editor was a guy named John Foster, and they basically were sort of a clearinghouse for like mini reviews of underground music. People could just send them tapes or records or anything, and they would write up little capsule reviews. So Rick sent them a copy of my 45, and it got a write-up there. And then I started, I sent out some to radio stations, and then I started getting some requests for them because it appeared in OP. And I think because it had appeared in OP, it got included in this book called Volume, the International Discography of the New Wave, which was about 2.5, 3 inches thick, which meant the collectors ended up hearing about it. So when eBay came around, I saw that it was selling for like $100 a copy, and as much I saw it sell at least once for like $500 on eBay.
Were you surprised?
Yes and no. I mean, partly why I made the record was because I was a collector, and I wanted to sort of put something into that pool of culture. I was buying at that point compilations of 1960s garage rock. So I think one of the places where we got diverted was realizing that it's just people putting out this stuff. It's all over. It's everywhere. And if you can get up enough money to do it, you can just do it yourself. And who knows who might hear it and strike a chord with them.
I saw a big commercial today for some brand whose name I forgot. Some actor begs the union reps to pretend he's what he's not. My TV said was too that lies. Learn about the money that I'll save if I just sit hypnotized and buy those products I didn't crave. Her kitchen has an electric range, a relic from the fire. Well, all the other women love microwaves. She's a new American outcast, a secretly cooking a pickup meal. Think the time that she could save. Her bitch find is roast beef waiting if she had a microwave. Efficiency, progress, efficiency, progress, efficiency, progress, technology, destruction. A scientist and he worked on the company's tech. But they flew without a shred of doubt. They're gonna use the best. Oh, I just can't take my disbelief at the crowd that's on TV. Professional psychological beats wield their power to deceive.
One of the things about seeing the garage rock comps is you knew what songs had made it into the top 10, and usually it was because the right DJ got his hand on it and started playing it in a specific market, and it broke out, and the record label was nimble enough to service and get copies out to where people were buying them. But once you get these compilations, you see there were hundreds, if not thousands, of songs that, with a little luck, could have had the same success, including by a Connecticut band. And the first, sort of after Nuggets, the first garage rock comp I got was this called Pebbles Volume 2. So, I mean, once Nuggets came out, there was like Pebbles, and there was Boulders, and there was Gravel, the whole series of these. But Pebbles Volume 2, and this is all stuff that was obscure. And one of the bands on it was this group, the Squires. And it turned out the Squires were a Connecticut band. I think they'd also gone by the name the Rogues, and they were based in Bristol. And this song was called Go Ahead. It was sort of a chimey folk rock type song. And they had another song on the first volume of Pebbles called Going All the Way. This song is a monster song. I mean, this song should have been in the top 10. It's short, it's catchy, and it ends on a just incredible guitar break. I mean, it's a masterpiece. They were on Atco, but they just didn't get, somehow they didn't get the push. This record didn't get in the right person's hands. But this is, I mean, it's just a great, great record. And there were a lot of bands doing that in Connecticut in the 1960s. A group called the Shags, Trodnosel Studios in Wallingford, put out a lot of records. They might have been called Synchron Sound then. And a reissue label based in New York called Sundazed Records actually put out a collection called Don't Press Your Luck.
I'm looking at it. Hank brought it in the studio.
Yeah, available. I don't know if it's still in print, but available both in vinyl for you hip kids and CDs for
I've got a vinyl version.
Your older people like me. It has a bunch of great cuts by bands like the Shags and the Bram Riggs set, who recorded at Synchron Studios. So I knew when we were putting our record out that was something that existed. That was a culture that existed, and my hopes were that somehow, my hopes were ridiculous that the record might become a hit. I listen to it now. I love my record. But
what was the record called?
The name of the band was Dada Banks, DADA, because it was at this point in time it was sort of like punk rock and the Dadaist art movement. So it was a pretentious name that I came up with, but for most of the time that we were playing in Randy's basement, we called ourselves the much more accurate Suburban Posers. So Randy didn't want to change the name, and he of course was right, because Suburban Posers would have been a great name for the band. But in order to mollify him, I named the record label Suburban Poser. And the two songs were Microwave on one side and Communism on the other. And Communism is when I learned to beware of irony in songwriting, because it was an over-the-top anti-communist song meant to be a critique of anti-communism, but some people took it literally on its face. And Microwave was a sort of a critique of consumerism. And actually there were original lyrics of Microwave before that were really offensive, and they were like punk rock type lyrics fortunately, Randy's girlfriend, later wife, said, "Oh, no, you've got to change that." And her wise advice prevailed on that. So, because there was a lot of, in punk, there was a bit of an ethos of, I don't speak French, but épater les bourgeoisie, offending the bourgeoisie, and just trying to be as offensive as possible. And our lyrics were, but fortunately we didn't release that into the world. But yeah, I had hopes that some collectors would find it interesting. And when in the late 90s I was a reporter for the New Haven Advocate, I got an email from a guy in Germany. Are you the Hank Hoffman of the Dada Banks? Yeah. So I still had enough copies to send him a copy or two. And I think his extra might have gone, somewhere else. And then I saw that a copy was for sale on eBay, and someone in Japan. And then, so I found out that there was a market for my record in Japan. And so it was interesting. The one that went for $500 had apparently been a copy that my youngest brother, who had passed away in the early 90s, had owned, and his widow had given all his records to a friend she worked at a newspaper. And I see this record of mine selling, and this guy who's nowhere near New Haven also has all these other, sort of New Haven-related records, and a test pressing of Happy Ending, his first record, which is my band from the 1980s till now. And so eventually it turned out that he had worked with my brother's widow, and so he made $500 off the 45, and he was kind enough to sort of send me the Happy Ending test pressing. He wasn't going to make any money off of that, unfortunately. I wish our album was as wanted on eBay as that 45, because
it should be.
It definitely should be, but
talk about that band.
Okay. So one of the things that came out of moving up to New Haven, my mom passed away in 1981, and so me and my two brothers inherited a little bit of money, enough for me to say, maybe I can actually put out a record again. And in one of these serendipitous things, I'd gotten to know and started playing music with a friend. When I'd been to see the band, the Radio Reptiles, at Ron's place, they said, "Hey, next time playing here, we got some friends who play some really wacky music, and you should come check them out." So I did. And friends, it was a duo going by the name of Tin Can Cow, and one of the members was like a guitarist and saxophonist. The other member sort of declaimed over this, like, almost beat poetry over this scronky type noise. And they had a slideshow that had pictures of roadkill. So it was great. It was really good stuff. And afterwards, I'm talking with a guitarist named Richard Brown, and he's saying, so where do you work? I said, I work at Connecticut Citizen Action Group, this consumer environmental group. He goes, "Hey, do you know this guy Jay Mundy?" I said, "The name doesn't ring a bell. Can you tell me a little about it?" "Oh, he's this tall guy. I think he's like a researcher." And I realized they were talking about the guy who was always making sarcastic remarks at staff meetings. I said, "Yeah, we used to play music with him, before he moved, out of New Haven." So I, next day at work, I got in touch with him, and I started going up to his place where he lived with his girlfriend in Rockville, Connecticut, and we would just get together with two guitars and make tapes, cover songs, his songs, which had like a very sort of 60s garage rock crossed with Bob Dylan feel, and then abstract crazy stuff. We'd make those tapes, and then we'd listen to recordings. And then when I ended up having some money, I said, well, we should make an album with like half my songs, half your songs. So we recruited the guitarist from Radio Reptiles to play bass, and a friend at Jay's from college, John Columbus, to play drums, and Richard Brown to play saxophone. So we recorded enough for a full album and a bonus 45, and it was called Have a Nice Day, and we adopted the smile face as like an ironic symbol of the band, because most of these songs were about, it was during the early Reagan years. They were about unemployment and environmental disaster and sleeplessness and bureaucracy and particularly nuclear war, the threat of nuclear war. And so we put that out into the world. But we didn't. We played a couple of gigs with that lineup, and then Jay decided he was a hermit and he didn't want to really be going out, and our bass player moved up to New Hampshire. And we reformed the band a little while, the next year, with Randy on bass now, and Richard Brown playing lead guitar and sax, and played the Grotto a number of times in 1985, and then basically, broke up, and I kept putting together different versions of it over the years. And now the version we have now first played together in the late 80s, and then Randy he had like high-powered jobs that he was doing for years, and I had other people involved, and I got the drummer from Radio Reptiles, and we've started playing together basically since 2012. And one interesting thing about that record, we recorded it in the spring of 1983, and by the time we'd done all the artwork and the collaged lyric booklet for the record and everything, and actually put out the record, that was around December. As it turned out, in September of 1983, we almost did have the nuclear war we thought we were going to have. There was a Soviet colonel, Soviet missile defense, civil defense, whose computers told him that there was incoming missiles from the U.S., and first one and then like up to 5. And he was supposed to basically press the alarm that would have triggered someone higher up launching a nuclear counterattack. But he didn't believe it was. He thought it was a false alarm, because he thought if they were actually sending nuclear missiles at us, that it would be a lot more than this. So he didn't do it, and it was right. It was like some way it was reading information from clouds or something. But he came, because he disobeyed express orders as to protocol you would follow. He didn't end the world then, and if he had, then our record about the world possibly ending from nuclear war wouldn't have come out. So there you go. We didn't realize how close we came. And I forget, Stanislav Petrov, and I think it was like September 26, 1983. And I swear to God, we should have a Stanislav Petrov Day that we commemorate every year, because this guy saved the world.
And you guys are working on some stuff now.
Yeah. So we got back together in 2012 and started playing, and we don't play out enough. We played 2 or 3 times a year, but we're recording a record now, original material. We've had one session where we laid down basic tracks on 4 songs, and we have another session coming up in a couple of weeks. I've got about 16 songs I'd like to do, including some that we've recorded before, but not with this lineup, that I really like the way we've developed them live, and I'd like to capture a studio version of that. And I mean, live, we're pretty raw. I'd say we have psychedelic influences, power pop, some garage rock influences. And with this, I'd like to make it more of a sort of a psychedelic pop record with more production, layers of sound. We're recording with engineer Scott Amore at Interspace Sound Labs in Durham. Scott's a great keyboard player. Used to play with the band The Butterflies of Love, excellent dream pop band that played around New Haven in the 1990s into the early 2000s. So I'm sure we'll have Scott playing on it, and probably recruit some other people to fill out the sound. And it's I actually did put out a couple of records, sort of solo projects. They were put out in 2020. The project was started in 2002, and this is sort of the most professional thing that I've ever done in music. Happy Ending was on hiatus, but I had like a whole bunch of songs that really sort of hung together. And so myself and Tom Smith, who had been in Happy Ending, it's the base of it, ended up connecting with a guy named Michael Deming, who has Studio 45, first in the Colt building in Hartford, and then he had his own studio building in Enfield. Anyway, Mike had been the producer, engineer on some great sounding pop records. He engineered, produced a couple of records for a band called the Lilies. He produced the first Pernice Brothers record. He had done some records on some local groups, which is how I heard about him, Shelley Vilauskis Experience and the Butterflies of Love. Also worked with the Apples in Stereo and Beechwood Sparks. And they were great sounding records, just really lush and pro. They sounded like pro records because he was a pro. So we started doing the record with him. I sent him demos, and he said, yeah. So he was going to charge me $10,000 for the whole thing. Needed $5,000 up front, and this was sort of went up. We had a click track, and I laid down scratch guitar and vocals, and then from there it was like first put the drums on, then put the bass on, rhythm guitar, and sort of built it up layer by layer. But it was a real education for me because I don't play with a band often enough to be with a drummer often enough, and I never really worked with a metronome. And I remember after the first drum session, I got an email from Tom Smith. He goes, "You need to get yourself a metronome because this guy is going to bust your ass on playing in tune and in time." And so I'd be playing and go, no, you're rushing, or you're late, and on and on. It just everything had to be right, done exactly right. And in fact, there were some guitar parts I came up with that I remember the first time it'd taken me forever to get down this guitar part on a song, and finally thought we had something. And I came back to the next session, and he goes, it's not working. It's not groovy enough. I'm going to have this session guy come in and have him tab it out and play it. And I'm like, but man, I want to play on my own record. He goes, you got to get over the ego, man. You think the Beach Boys records would have sounded good if they insisted they had to play on their own record? It's like, yeah, okay. But it was funny. There was a different song after that when he sort of felt the same way, and I had like this fuzz guitar part on it. And one of the things I sometimes do when I play is I have this like screeching slide up on a note sort of that I got from Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls. And so he had this guy come in, and the guy tabs the thing out, including the screech note. So it's perfectly like played from this point to that point exactly in time, which of course is totally antithetical to what you're doing there. You're going round, 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 round. It was like perfect, tabbed out here to here. So that was amusing to me at any rate. But at the time, first Mike moved his studio from the Colt building in Hartford to Enfield, so there was a delay there. Then he had some other projects he was working on. He got an album with another album with the Pernice Brothers, which ended up being called Live a Little, which is a fantastic record. I mean, have you ever heard Live a Little by Pernice? Are you familiar with Pernice Brothers? Oh.
I'm going to go look them up.
Oh, Joe Pernice is an unbelievable songwriter. Really, he's a graduate MFA program at University of Massachusetts. He's had a novel. He's a writer, and he's just got an incredible ear for a pop hook. But his lyrics are fantastic. So this record, Live a Little, I remember the first time I listened to it, Mike was playing me some stuff in studios. Oh yeah, with this sound, we were trying to get something like Wings, and I didn't quite get it. Then it took me like a couple listens to say, this is an unbelievable record. Just song, hook after hook, great playing, phenomenal lyrics. But anyway, all these things were delaying the project and limiting the amount of studio time I could get. And then Mike started his own boutique microphone and pro audio equipment business, so there was that. And finally, around 2009, he said, you need to take the rest of the budget and maybe go to Scott Moore and finish the record up with him. So over the next couple of years, I ended up doing the rest of the overdubs with Scott, and then it took a couple of years to get mixed, which Mike actually showed up and to help oversee. And so finally I had to get it mastered, and finally got it out as 2 mini records under the name The Alex Butterfield. Put those out each about 26 minutes long, and put those out in 2020. And it's like one's called Psychedelic Pop and one's called Pop Cycle. And that was really trying to just layer sounds, and there's a lot in those songs. I had Dean Falcone, great New Haven-based guitarist, helped with a lot of lead guitar parts. He also played a real sitar on songs. I played electric sitar on songs. Scott Moore played keyboards. A few songs we had sort of string sections, and Dean wrote the parts for 2 of those. I wrote the parts for one of them. So I got in friends to play violin, viola, and cello on those. And just really made it a production, sort of thinking about what was happening in pop in 1966 and 1967, and trying to sort of touch that idea. And I got some nice reviews, so I was happy with that. And sort of that's with what we're recording now. I hope to sort of do something similar, except we're playing together as a band to lay down the basic tracks rather than playing to a click track. Which is good, and I think what we're getting is solid. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to fleshing it out and really finding something there in terms of interesting textures.
You mentioned it a bit, but you were part of the Daggett Street community for many years.
Yeah, Daggett Street was this fascinating place. And, it had been like sweatshops and textile places. And I guess it was just on the edge of the Hill neighborhood, just off of Congress Avenue. And so when I moved up there in 1980, there were all sorts of jerry-rigged lofts. There were a lot of artists who lived there because they could have like a big loft space to work in, and the rents were relatively cheap. I think what I was paying per month, after subtracting what Rick's girlfriend Barb was paying, was like either $125 or $175 a month. So, I mean, that would be more in today's dollars, but it was affordable. And it would actually, so there were a lot of interesting artists there. There was a fancy, furniture shop, the floor above me, machine shops, and it was a cool place to live. It had vibe. It wasn't necessarily a safe place to live. Daggett Street sort of was set up 3 or 4 buildings with like an inner courtyard. And I remember one night we were out in the inner courtyard with Rick, and we were walking his dog. When we came back in, come up to my loft, and to get into the main part of my loft, you sort of walk down this hallway that we had built that set off the workspace for his girlfriend. And Rick was walking ahead of me. I hear him going, "Hey, hey!" And it's like a couple of guys had like smashed out one of the windows. They'd come up the fire escape and smashed out one of the windows, and were trying to break into the loft at that time. And we yelled. They sauntered out of the alley. And I ended up having, apparently the previous resident must have encountered something similar because the window had been nailed shut. So they weren't able to get in, and put up steel reinforced bars. But it was a cool place. And I remember there was a loft down below me that the guy who was a photographer had just like basically abandoned. I had months of unpaid back rent, just abandoned. And so we got into that loft because Barb was considering maybe renting that space, and there was just tons of left behind, photographs and art books and pins, buttons that he'd made, and it was just like this treasure trove of culture detritus that we were able to pillage. And one of the things that I got out of there was a copy of the John Lennon book. A Spaniard in the Works, his like second book. And in it, there were a couple of tickets to something in Pittsburgh. And it wasn't until about 2 or 3 years ago, I'd always sort of wondered, geez, I wonder if those are actually tickets to a Beatles concert. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, I was down in the basement. I had looked at it, and I thought, you know what? Tonight I'm going to pull out my copy of Mark Lewisohn's, Complete Beatles, which basically has a rundown of what they did, every day, and look this date up. And sure enough, they were tickets for a Beatles concert in Pittsburgh in, I think 1964 or something. And I went up and I showed my wife, and she goes, "Look at the date." It was like, I don't know how many years, it was the exact same day of the year. If the tickets were September 19th, I had finally decided to look, and look them up on September 19th. So, cue the Twilight Zone theme. But anyway, so that was one of the things that I got from Daggett Street. But it was a really interesting place. I lived there for about 3 years. I remember one Christmas I was there, and used to have no problem sleeping because, most, it wasn't like there were places working. But all of a sudden, as it comes to Christmas, the furniture shop was going all night. It was like, and bam, 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 until like 2, 3 in the morning. And finally, I went up there, and it's like, God, why are you guys working? Oh, we just decided this year the thing to do is we'll just make gifts for our families instead of just buying them. And it's like, can you not? Oh, sorry, we got to do this. And it was cold in the winter, so it was rough living. It was a real urban loft. And then, after I'd moved out, years passed by, things got more and more, people getting more and more fancy. People would really do up their lofts nicely until finally, someone apparently had like a minor fire from like a hot plate or something, and the town pretended to all of a sudden realize that there were people living there. I mean, the whole time I was living there, I had a fold-out couch because, there had been instances of the housing folks coming around and saying, hey, you can't be living here. But of course, everybody knew that people lived at Daggett Street for decades. And it wasn't until sometime in the 2000, maybe even 2010s that they finally said, you got to get out of here. And I assumed Yale was kind of behind this and that they had some kind of plan for the building, but I actually haven't heard what's happened with Daggett Street or whether it's even occupied at this point. But it was a way station for, bohemians coming into the city. It was well known for, some bands lived there, would have concerts in their lofts, and artists lived there. And, when Art Space was having citywide open studios, Daggett Street would be a stop on, visit the open studios in Daggett Street. So, the city pretending like, oh my God, are you kidding? There are people living there was, it's like the scene from Casablanca. I'm shocked to find there's gambling going on in this establishment.
New Haven advocate.
Yeah. After I worked for 4 years at Connecticut Citizen Action Group, I decided I wanted to get out and do something maybe more arts-related, and I was interested in graphic design. I ended up getting a job with a printing business, doing like a giant commercial halftone camera. I did that for about 9 years, and it was going nowhere, and I didn't enjoy it. And so I went back to school and got a master's degree at Wesleyan, what was called their Master's of Arts and Liberal Studies program. And one of the last classes I took there was on creative nonfiction or literary journalism. And the teacher said, you could do this. You could. So I knew someone at the Advocate, Chris Arnott, and talked to him, and basically got an internship there. I mean, it was one of their older interns, but got an internship and did well. And so first they started having me freelance, and then I became a full-timer for about 3 years on the staff, writing news and culture pieces. And the Advocate had a great staff at that time. It was there were about 3 or 4 independent alternative weeklies in the chain. One in Fairfield County, one in New Haven, one in Hartford, and another one up in Massachusetts. And some great journalism was done. But then it was bought out by the Hartford Courant, and then the Hartford Courant was bought out, and eventually they were cutting the budget and they closed down the Advocate. And, but at the time, it was a cool way to write about interesting political topics that I was interested in, but also write about visual art and write about music and the music scene. I wasn't their main music writer, but I could, get things if I had a particular interest in it. So while I was there, they had a reunited Question Mark and the Mysterians were coming to play a club in New Haven called the Tune-In. And it was actually all the members of the original band who had the hit with 96 Tears. And actually, both their albums have a lot of great songs on it. So before that, I was able to write a preview article with a phone interview with the guitarist and a phone interview with Question Mark himself, who was sort of a real, very much, have you ever met him?
I hope you have that tape, yeah.
I do have those tapes. He's a very out there guy. And the Remains also played a reunion show that they actually were playing it down in New York City. But I said, hey, maybe the Fairfield County Weekly would let me, write a preview article about the Remains, because they had the strong Westport connections. So that they let me do that, and I was able to interview Barry Tashian and went to that show. So there's fun stuff like that. But that whole alternate weekly realm, which had been super important to underground culture, basically collapsed. I think a lot of it due to the internet, which has impacted print journalism everywhere, but also corporate concentrations, another factor in that.
And obviously, best video.
Yeah. At the same time that I was starting to do the internship at at the New Haven Advocate, I got a part-time job at Best Video, this independent video store in Hamden. And I loved movies. And this place was an incredible community place. It had, first of all, it had a huge selection of movies. And the guy who ran it, Hank Paper, he's still around. He is just incredibly knowledgeable about film, and also a very gregarious person. And he'd created, a lot of the people who worked there had connections to the arts. They were painters, they were musicians, because he liked to surround himself with people like that. And it was this real community hub. It was a throwback to when small businesses used to be anchors of the community where people would gather. And so it was interesting working there because you had a lot of academics from Yale, you had artists coming in, and it was hopping because back then, pre-streaming, pre-Netflix, that was where you could get, movies. And so, I would work a Saturday night and you would be going nonstop because it was all VHS tapes, so they were big. And so you had like stacks of them. You had to return to the shelf nonstop. You had people calling in on reservations. You had to be putting things back out on the floor. You had a line at the counter for people to check things out. And it was a sort of real fun slacker job type place to work because you were in among interesting people. You were working with interesting people, and you were meeting interesting people who were, members of Best Video and renting. So I had been a political science major in college, and I got to, one of the people I'm waiting on is Robert Dahl, who was known as the Dean of American Political Scientists, and whose book had been one of my texts in my Intro to American Government class. So meeting people like that. And even when I ended up working full-time at the New Haven Advocate, I found Best Video such an interesting place that I continued to do every other Saturday night there because I just wanted to keep my hands in. And when I finally stopped working for the Advocate, then I went full-time at Best Video. And as the video store business started to go down the tubes, we had to think about, well, what can we do, to be creative? And we would always be having people come in and say, oh, God, I hope you guys, everybody else is closing. I hope you guys don't close. We really support you. And the question was, if push came to shove and we asked you to, open up your wallet, would you support us? And we're trying to find ways to bring people in. And at the point at which, people really weren't renting VHS tapes anymore, they sold off a lot of them. And because they took up space, it cleared out some space. I said, well, I know musicians around here. Maybe we should start seeing about having like a music show once a week. People would come in and it's the show, and then maybe they'll rent a movie. And we had rented out part of the space to a coffee shop. So it was starting to have like a cafe atmosphere. So we started doing that, first thinking it would just be acoustic music. But as it turned out, walls and walls of DVDs and VHS tape are excellent acoustic baffling. And with the low ceilings and the carpet on the floor, and the place had like really good sound. And we realized, I remember we had one group in. We started to say, okay, maybe we can have slightly larger ensembles. And we had one group, a group called Rope, led by this guy from the old New Haven scene, Sal Paradise, come in, and their drummer Pat Quinn comes in, and he has this huge drum kit. And I go, oh no, this is going to be too loud for the space. But as it turned out, the space just absorbed extra sound. I mean, you could have a punk band there, and it would absorb the excess sound. So it was just, the punk band sounded really good. It wasn't too much. And so it went from one night to 2 nights to 3 nights, and then we started having film screenings and lectures and readings. And that enabled us to create enough of a new identity that when Hank Paper was finally ready to throw in the towel because he was just, he was spending thousands of dollars out of his pocket every month to keep the place going, that with the support of people in the neighborhood, we ended up being able to convert it into a not-for-profit, a real 501c3 not-for-profit in 2015 called Best Video Film and Cultural Center. So for me, that was an extension of why I moved to New Haven in the first place. I moved up here because there was a community of people who, I mean, I sort of felt like, this shy outcast, outwardly normal looking, but, weirdo kid who, didn't fit in, and, started finding a community sort of based on that's okay, that's cool. And so, I moved up here for a community, and then it was great with the conversion of Best Video to start creating a hub for a community like that in a place like that. And it flowed out of the music. It flowed out of, I eventually got involved, and I was writing around about the visual arts scene. So, I was networking with all these people and getting a sense of how, culture works, and how grassroots culture works, and how important it is, and how, life-affirming grassroots culture is. So Best Video, I sort of felt like, okay, I'm contributing to this, to sort of sustaining grassroots culture, and the joy that comes from, getting together with other people in real rather than virtual space. And so it feels like all of a continuum to me. It wasn't planned. It was all sort of, this happened and then that happened. I met this person and that person, all these serendipitous, things along the way. So you and I have been talking about reading Mark Lewison's big book about the Beatles up till 1963, and there's all these contingencies and anecdotes and parts along the way where this person met that person, but if they hadn't, the Beatles in Hamburg playing in this, this dive bar, and some, German artsy bohemian types happened to be walking by, and one of them heard them and said, hey, let's go in there and check it out, and ended up, giving the Beatles connection to a certain, high culture mindset that was a big influence on them. It's the role of contingency in life is it's pretty amazing. I mean, I think about how my continuing to play music sort of flowed out of a random question in a conversation with Richard Brown at Ron's place in 1983, where he sort of said, where do you work? And then told me about this person he knew that worked there, and that person became someone I could work with as a musician and form our own band. And so much has flowed from that. And I don't think the role of sort of accident and circumstance and contingency and serendipity is something we really think about that often. How much of who we are and where we are, flowed out of chance encounters.
But also, I mean, you're definitely one of the people, the main, people in New Haven that you would cite as kind of community in music and arts and visionary leaders. I mean, it's the reason I stayed. I could have moved back to New York and thought about it. And I was like, I love it here. And part of the reason I love it is because, similar to you, I've been able to do a lot of different things that I wouldn't have been able, I would have been cast out in New York. Sorry, there's already 50 other people trying to do that,
Yeah.
And New Haven, it's a wide open field. And, we've just gone through so much in your trajectory and your history. And you've written about the art scene, you've played in bands, you've put out records. Is music the driving force? What's the driving force?
I think music, sort of say the thing that's given me greatest pleasure in my life is, Beatles music. And I say, just my wife and my son, but the Beatles had almost a 20-year head start on me meeting my wife. So, it's not a fair contest. But music, I'm not a religious person, but music is one of those things that makes me say, well, I'm a spiritual person, because there's something, music isn't a physical thing you can hold. I mean, you can hold a guitar, and I try and hold as many of them as possible. But music is just sound waves in air, and that it can touch us so powerfully is a spiritual thing. How do you explain that? And the meaning of it, and all the different kinds of music, and the different ways it touches people. Like I mean, when I'm booking Best Video, I try and book lots of different kinds of music, and not really cover bands, but jazz and singer-songwriter, and we've had bluegrass groups and rock and punk and abstract music, and some of it, touches my pleasure center, like guitar-based, rock and roll, and others of it I can really appreciate, what the musicians are doing. It's not my pleasure center, but I know it's other people's, and I can appreciate it for the the talent and the skill that goes into it. But music is just such a incredibly moving thing. It can be joyous. It can touch so many emotional moods, color your life. It can be in the background. It can be in the foreground. And for me, I felt like I wanted to make some of my own. Just like when I was a kid, I wanted to make my own comic books. Just to entertain myself, and if fortunately I have like a few friends who like what I come up with, and and we we're like great friends, and we just love being together. Our practices are 70% sitting around, shooting the shit and drinking wine and having a great time, and 30% is getting up and playing music, and that's part of the community aspect of it. But make some, if I like making records that I'd like to listen to, I like records that have fuzz guitar. So when I write records, I want some fuzz guitar. I want sounds in it that touch my pleasure center. Like some people want to hear the sounds of a mandolin, or a bluegrass fiddle, or some people want to hear synthesizer sounds. And for me, there are certain guitar textures and sounds of a certain period of rock and roll that imprinted themselves on me. And we're in an interesting time now, because we went through a period in history. A friend of mine, Alan Lowe, who's a jazz historian and a jazz musician, recently had a post on Facebook about that there was a period of time when there were new things, experimental. It was coming out all the time, and we don't really seem to be in that time. And I think there may have been a historically specific thing to art in the 20th century, where various arts were moving towards abstraction, and technology played a role in it. Like I think the electric guitar and electricity played an obvious role in rock and roll, and then in the 1960s in amplification, and then I think technology obviously played a role in hip hop and electronic music. But where there may not be a forward new thing to sort of create. And my thought is, people just have to decide, what do you like to hear? What do you want to listen to? And just try and make your own personal vision of that. Maybe the time for sort of trying to brave new frontiers of music is, just I have to let that go by the side, and just, what pleases you? What kind of music do you want to make? Because the interesting thing about it is, whenever we make music, unless you're a cover band who wants to try and do note for note perfection, when we're trying to make our own music, it always sounds like us. Depending on how good you are, that may be good or may not be great. May not be that interesting, but we can only make a version of us, and so it's a personal sound. And I think that's what's interesting to me about a lot of the music I listen to, even if it's very simple, raw, quote unquote, primitive music. Is it always has a certain personality to it, and the humanity in it is part of that, the personality and the individuality. Even if you're working in genre, some soul comes through it.
Anything else you want to add? You don't have to. We've discussed a lot. But yeah.
I know. I'm sure I'm going to think.
No, this is great.
Think of something. On the drive home. I should have said.
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
All right, that was great.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.